When I was younger, around 14 or 15 years old, my family had this tradition of going camping every summer. We usually stuck to state parks. Not the most remote places on Earth, but far enough from the noise and crowds that you could hear crickets at night and see stars without the city glow blocking them out. My parents had this old canvas tent they'd had since before I was born. It smelled like old nylon and earth no matter how much they aired it out. We always went to the same spot, this loop on the back end of a state park about 3 hours from home. The sites were spaced out with a decent bit of woods in between, and a little creek ran behind the last row of sites, which was where we usually set up. That summer, my best friend, I'll just call him Eric, came with us. He and I had known each other since kindergarten. We were the kind of friends that barely needed to talk. We just did things together and understood each other. Every time we went camping, we had this thing we did at night. We called it the ritual. It wasn't anything special or mystical or weird. It was just what we called it when we walked into the woods at night, usually with flashlights, but most of the time we tried to use them as little as possible. We'd leave them off unless we tripped or got too disoriented. There was something about being in the dark woods, the feeling of being alone but not alone, that made it feel different, more serious, like we were explorers or something. This one night, it was maybe the third night of the trip, we decided to go further than usual. Normally, we'd circle the campground, maybe cut through the shallow trails nearby, walk along the creek a bit, and head back. But that night, we felt a little braver. I don't know if it was because we were older or because we'd done it so many times before and nothing had ever happened. Either way, we decided to walk further into the woods than we ever had. It was just after 10 p.m. The fire back at our site had died down to coals, and my parents were already in their sleeping bags. The campground itself was quiet. You could hear occasional muffled voices, someone zipping up a tent, the soft metallic clink of cookware being packed away. We grabbed our flashlights, told each other we wouldn't use them unless we absolutely had to, and started walking. The woods beyond the campground got dark fast. The moon was only a sliver that night, and the trees in that area were thick. Oaks, pines, some underbrush, but nothing too bad. There was a narrow, unofficial trail, not one of the marked ones, but a path people had clearly used before. It started behind a log where campers must have crossed over the years. We slipped over it and started down the trail, talking a little at first about dumb stuff, school, a girl he liked, what we'd do if we saw a bear, stuff like that. But mostly we were quiet. We walked in a single line, me ahead, him behind. The forest floor was soft, and even with our feet crunching on dry twigs now and then, the silence felt deep. We had gone maybe half a mile in, definitely further than we'd ever gone before when we first heard it. A soft, almost wet kind of whisper, just a low murmur behind us, not too close, but close enough that we both heard it at the same time. We stopped walking. No words passed between us. We both just froze and slowly turned around. The flashlights were out but still in our hands. I remember my thumb sliding onto the switch automatically. The whispering stopped. I clicked my flashlight on and swept the beam behind us. Eric did the same a second later. The woods lit up in twin cones of pale light, but there was nothing there. Just trees, brush, the narrow path we had come in on. We stood there for a bit, straining our ears. No wind, no animals, nothing. After a few seconds, I clicked my light back off. Eric did the same. We stood in the dark again. Felt thicker now. We kept walking, just a little more cautious, not saying anything. My eyes kept flicking over my shoulder even though I couldn't see much behind us. Every few steps, a part of me expected to hear something, but everything stayed quiet for another minute or two. Then it came again. Whispering, closer this time. We stopped immediately. Eric's breathing changed. I remember it because I heard him suck in a quick breath and hold it. The whispering was behind us again, but also off to the side. I couldn't make out the words. It didn't even sound like real words. Just low, broken up syllables, maybe even someone trying to talk through dry lips. I raised the flashlight and turned it on. And that's when we saw her. About 20 feet back, crouched low to the ground, was a woman. She was crawling on her hands and knees, slowly. Her head was down, and her hair was hanging forward, but what I could see of her face looked dirty. She was wearing dark clothes, jeans, and what looked like a sweatshirt. Her arms were streaked with dirt, and her hands looked scraped up. She didn't look up right away. She just kept crawling, whispering random, jumbled nonsense. We both stood completely still. Eventually, she lifted her head. When her eyes met ours, she stopped moving. Then slowly, she stood up. Not fast, just this weird, slow, slightly off-balance motion, like she wasn't entirely steady on her feet. Her clothes were hanging off her like they'd been wet and dried in the sun. Stiff, wrinkled. She looked at us and didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then, in a flat, slurred voice, she said something about looking for her campsite. We didn't move. I didn't even know what to think. This woman had just crawled up out of nowhere, mumbling to herself, and now she was standing there acting like nothing was wrong. She looked maybe in her 20s, hard to tell in the low light. Her eyes didn't seem focused. She kept blinking slowly, like she was fighting to stay awake or like she was too drunk to keep them open properly. We didn't speak. We just sort of turned around and started walking back the way we came. Slowly at first, then a little quicker once we saw she was following us. I kept my flashlight on now, lighting the path ahead. Eric walked a few feet behind me, glancing over his shoulder every so often. She walked behind us, not saying much, sometimes muttering again. At one point, she tripped and fell forward, caught herself on her hands, and then got back up without a sound. The whole walk back took maybe 15 minutes, but it felt way longer. When we finally got close enough to see the first flicker of campfires through the trees, I felt this weight lift off my chest. Not all the way, but enough. I didn't know what we were going to do with her. We didn't want to just leave her there, but she wasn't making much sense. We walked her through the edge of the campground loop, and eventually we found a site with a few tents and a folding table lit by a lantern. A group of people were sitting there drinking, laughing. She walked into the site like nothing had happened. We stood a little distance away, waiting to see what would happen. One of the people at the site noticed her and said something like, "Oh hey, there you are." She mumbled something back and sat down on a cooler. Nobody freaked out. Nobody looked surprised. They just handed her a drink. We waited a few more seconds, then walked back to our site without saying a word. Later that night, I kept thinking about how weird the whole thing had been. She'd been completely alone in the woods, crawling around in the dirt, mumbling random stuff. If we hadn't gone that far out, if we hadn't heard her, she might have been out there all night. There were no bathrooms out that far, no lights, nothing. And the scariest part, to me, was how no one had even noticed she was gone. The next morning, we saw her again walking to the real bathroom building near the trailhead. She looked more put together, cleaner, wearing a hoodie and sunglasses. She passed by without looking at us. Eric and I didn't do the ritual again that trip. We stuck to the fire, played cards, talked less about walking the woods. When we got home, we didn't even tell our parents about it. Not because we were scared of getting in trouble, but because we didn't know what to say. It sounded made up even to us. But to this day, I still think about how close that was. How easy it would have been for her to just never find her way back. How if we hadn't gone further than usual, we never would have crossed her path. It made me think different about those woods, about how quiet they could be, about how someone could get lost and no one would even notice. It stopped being a game after that. The woods didn't feel like a challenge anymore. They felt real, heavy, like something that could swallow people up and just keep going like nothing happened. That was the last time I did the ritual. After that, I kept to the paths. About 10 years ago, I went camping at Ginny Springs in Florida. It was early spring, warm during the day and a little chilly at night. The kind of weather that makes you want to be outdoors. I was in my mid-20s back then, and I had been doing a lot of solo camping trips around the Southeast. I liked Ginny Springs because it was a bit more social than the other state parks and campgrounds I'd been to. Still surrounded by nature, but with more people around, especially near the river. I got to the park on a Friday afternoon. The drive had taken longer than I expected because of construction on I-75, and I arrived with just enough time to set up my tent before the sun dipped behind the trees. I had a spot near the water but a bit back from the main beach area. It wasn't completely secluded, but I wasn't elbow to elbow with anyone either. There were other tents within view, maybe 20 or 30 yards away, but there were enough trees between us that I felt like I had a good mix of privacy and security. I could still hear people talking and laughing from their campsites, especially as night fell and the quietness of the forest amplified every little sound. That night started out just like any other camping trip. I made a small fire, cooked some food, and sipped on a beer as I sat in my camp chair listening to the bugs and the far-off sound of music from someone else's Bluetooth speaker. Nothing loud or obnoxious, just a steady background hum of people enjoying themselves. There was a group of college kids somewhere not far down the trail from me, and I could hear them talking and laughing loudly. It didn't bother me. I kind of liked it, honestly. I wasn't really in the mood for complete silence. Around 10 or 10:30, things began to wind down. I put out my fire, brushed my teeth at the nearest spigot, and climbed into my tent. I remember lying down and checking my phone one last time before putting it on airplane mode. I had downloaded a few podcasts just in case I couldn't sleep, but I ended up dozing off fairly quickly. The air had that clean, earthy smell that I only seem to notice when I'm away from cities. It was a still night, barely any breeze. Just the occasional rustle of leaves from a squirrel or raccoon moving around nearby. I woke up maybe an hour or two later. I'm not sure what time it was exactly, but it was well past midnight. Everything was pitch black except for the dim glow of my solar lantern, which had been fading steadily since sunset. At first, I didn't know why I had woken up. It wasn't a sudden noise or a dream that jolted me. I just opened my eyes and felt uneasy. It was that strange type of stillness that doesn't feel peaceful. It felt heavy, almost like the air had changed. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a massive tree falling. It was distant at first, maybe 100 yards away. It started with a cracking sound, sharp and dry, like thick bones breaking. Then came the groaning, deep and strained, the kind of sound that vibrates low in your chest. I lay completely still, trying to place it, and then came the crash. The full weight of the tree slamming into the forest floor was enormous. The whole ground trembled, not violently, but enough that I could feel it through the nylon floor of my tent. Birds flew up from the trees, squawking in surprise. Somewhere nearby, someone cursed loudly. I could hear zippers opening, people shuffling around in their tents, and flashlights clicking on. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Trees fall. Florida has soft, wet ground, and sometimes trees just go over. I figured it had probably been rotting for a while, maybe struck by lightning a few weeks earlier, and finally gave way under its own weight. I didn't get up. I laid there listening to the sounds around me settle back down. A few people talked for a minute, then things got quiet again. I rolled over, trying to find a more comfortable spot on my sleeping pad, and figured I'd fall back asleep soon. But maybe 10 minutes later, I started to hear voices again. Not casual talking like earlier. These were sharper, more frantic. Multiple people talking at once. There was movement, fast movement. I unzipped the flap of my tent and poked my head out. I couldn't see much at first. It was still mostly dark except for a few beams of flashlight cutting through the trees. A cluster of people were about 50 feet away, huddled around something on the ground. I heard the word ambulance spoken loudly, more than once. Someone was waving a flashlight in wide circles, trying to signal something or someone. A few other campers were walking in the direction of the commotion, slowly, hesitantly, like they were trying to figure out whether to help or not. I stepped out of my tent fully and put on my shoes. I didn't know what I was walking toward, but I could feel that something wasn't right. I grabbed my own flashlight and walked toward the growing crowd. As I got closer, I started to make sense of the scene. A tree had fallen across one of the tent sites. A massive oak, probably 40 feet tall, thick at the base and heavy with limbs. The trunk had smashed straight down on top of a large family-style tent. The fabric had collapsed inward like a crushed can, poles snapped in half, the guy lines torn from the ground. Debris was scattered everywhere, coolers, shoes, folding chairs. A man was lying on the ground next to the tent, one arm draped awkwardly across his chest. Two people were kneeling next to him, one shining a flashlight in his face, the other pressing something, maybe a shirt or a towel, against his head. Blood was pooling in the dirt beside him. I didn't need to see much more to understand that the situation was bad. The expressions on the people's faces told me everything. A few of the younger people nearby were crying, one of them hyperventilating. Someone was on a phone, trying to describe the scene to emergency services. There was panic, but it wasn't chaotic. People were trying to do what they could, but it was clear there wasn't much that could be done. I stood there for a minute or two, unsure of what to do with myself. I didn't know the people, didn't know the victim. The shock of seeing it all unfold just kind of froze me in place. I started to back away, feeling like I was intruding. More people were showing up now, drawn by the lights and the voices. After maybe 20 minutes, we heard the distant chop of helicopter blades. It got louder quickly, echoing off the trees and the river. A few people moved out into the open area near the clearing to wave their flashlights up at the sky. The chopper hovered above us for a few moments, then circled and slowly descended to a small field not far from the main road. I didn't follow it. I stayed back in the trees. A few people ran off in that direction to meet the EMTs and guide them in. A few more minutes passed, and paramedics appeared through the trees carrying gear. They moved quickly but carefully, checking on the man, talking to the people who had tried to help. They loaded him onto a backboard and secured him before carrying him out through the trees to where the helicopter was waiting. It all happened fast, but at the same time, it felt like time had stretched out longer than it really had. After the helicopter lifted off again, people began to drift back toward their own campsites. It was quieter now. No music, no laughing, just soft voices and the occasional crackle of a fire being put out. I walked back to my tent and sat in my camp chair for a while, staring into the dark. The adrenaline had worn off, but the unease hadn't. I didn't feel scared, exactly, but I felt unsettled, vulnerable. That tree could have fallen anywhere. It just happened to fall where it did. If the angle had been even slightly different, it might have landed on a different campsite. Mine even. I hadn't thought much about trees when picking a campsite. I always looked for level ground, a good spot for the tent, some distance from others. But that night, I looked up at the silhouette of the trees over my tent and saw them differently. Every creak of a branch in the breeze made my skin crawl. I didn't sleep much after that. I lay in my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest and thinking about how quickly something can go wrong. There was no warning, no signs, just the normal sounds of the woods, then a snap, a groan, and everything changes. In the morning, rangers came through the campground. They talked to people quietly, taking notes. The campsite where the tree had fallen was roped off with yellow tape. A truck came to haul away the crushed tent and whatever else was left behind. I didn't stick around long. I packed up my gear and drove home in silence, the radio off. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. Every time I go camping, I take a long, hard look at the trees around me. I check for dead limbs, for trunks that lean too much, for signs of rot or soft ground. I camp a little farther from big trees now. I guess you could say I'm cautious, maybe too cautious, but once you see something like that, it stays with you. It wasn't the kind of horror you see in movies. There were no monsters, no ghosts, no shadowy figures in the woods. Just nature doing what it does. A tree falls. Someone happens to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's it. That's all it takes. It's the kind of thing that reminds you how fragile everything is, how little control we really have. We think we're prepared, we think we're safe, but out there in the woods, sometimes you're just at the mercy of gravity, wind, and chance. And sometimes that's the scariest part. It was the second weekend of October, sometime around 10 years ago, when I decided to go camping alone for a couple nights. I'd done a handful of solo trips by then, mostly in North Florida and southern Georgia. This time I went to a place I'd heard a lot about but hadn't visited yet. Ginny Springs, just outside of High Springs, Florida. People mostly go there in the summer to tube the river, but I figured with it being fall, the crowd would be smaller, the bugs less intense, and the weather just cool enough to make sleeping outside comfortable. I drove in mid-morning on a Friday and picked a spot not too close to the entrance, but not so far into the woods that I'd have to hike a long way. I found a nice clearing, a decent distance from the nearby campsites, with a few tall trees for shade and enough flat ground to set up my tent comfortably. The springs were a short walk away. There were other campers around, but not too many. A few families with kids, some college kids grouped together near the river, and one or two other solo setups like mine. I spent most of that day just walking around and taking in the area. The water at Ginny Springs is unreal crystal clear, almost glowing blue in the right sunlight. I waded into one of the smaller springs for a bit, just to feel the cold water against my legs. The air was warm enough that the chill felt refreshing. I cooked dinner around 6, cleaned up, then settled by my fire as the sun went down. I had a small chair and just sat there listening to the night, the occasional hoot of an owl, frogs from somewhere closer to the water, a distant group of people laughing, probably already half drunk. It was peaceful. Sometime during the night, I went to bed. I'm not even sure what time it was. My fire had burned down to glowing embers and the woods had gone quiet except for the usual night sounds. I zipped myself into the tent, laid back on my sleeping pad, and must have dozed off pretty quickly. I always sleep lightly when I camp, especially alone. Every little snap of a twig or rustle in the leaves wakes me up just enough to become aware again before I drift off. What woke me this time wasn't subtle. It was loud, deep, splitting, almost like a cracking thunder right overhead. A sound that felt like it came from inside the ground and then echoed through the air above me. In that split second between waking up and realizing what I'd heard, my first thought was that it was thunder. But it wasn't. It was something heavier, more deliberate. It was the unmistakable sound of a tree falling. Not a little branch or a rotten limb, but a full-grown tree. I laid there listening. The woods had gone still. No frogs, no owls, not even crickets. Everything had paused. I didn't hear the tree actually hit the ground, at least not the impact I expected, but the cracking and splitting were clear. I sat up, unzipped my tent a few inches, and looked out. My fire pit had long gone dark. The moon was out enough that I could make out some shapes and outlines, but nothing was moving. Nothing seemed out of place. I figured it must have been somewhere deeper in the woods. Maybe one of those huge oaks finally gave way. Happens all the time. The roots rot and they fall over in the middle of the night. So I laid back down, though I didn't fall asleep right away. I just stared up at the roof of my tent and waited to hear anything else. Maybe 15 minutes went by. Could have been 10. Could have been 20. I don't really know. But after a while, I started to hear something else. Not the forest coming back to life, but voices. Not one or two, but several. Talking low and quick. They were coming from the direction of the other campsites. Not directly next to mine, but close enough I could make out that it wasn't laughter or drunken chatter anymore. It was more serious, like something had happened. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me and I unzipped my tent all the way and stepped out. I didn't bring my flashlight because the moonlight was strong enough and I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I just walked quietly toward the sound, maybe 100 feet or so. As I got closer, I could make out flashlights bouncing through the trees. There were maybe 10 or 12 people standing around, pointing at something. I came up beside a guy I'd seen earlier that day. He had been setting up a hammock with his girlfriend, and I stopped next to him. Nobody said anything to me, but the scene explained itself. A tree had come down on a tent. It wasn't some small sapling either. It was one of those massive old pines, tall and heavy, probably hollowed out in the middle. The trunk had landed directly across a tent that had been set up in a clearing not far from mine. The tent itself was flattened. The poles snapped. The rainfly peeled back like tissue paper. People were just standing around looking at it, whispering. Some had their phones out. One guy was kneeling by the trunk, looking under it like he was trying to see if anyone was still in there. Not long after I showed up, one of the campers ran back toward the main road, probably to find a ranger or someone with authority. A couple minutes later, I saw headlights bouncing through the trees and a park utility vehicle pulled up. A ranger or security guy stepped out, asked a few questions, and immediately radioed something in. After that, things started moving fast. The next 20 or 30 minutes were a blur. More rangers showed up. A few of them had headlamps and medical gear. They pulled people away from the scene, asked them to stand back. I stayed on the fringe of the group, just watching. After a while, one of the rangers put up some yellow caution tape around the tree and the tent, which made the whole thing feel even more surreal. We all knew something bad had happened, but nobody really said it. Then I saw the helicopter. It came in low, noisy as hell, and hovered above a clearing a bit farther away where the trees weren't as thick. Some of the rangers guided it in with lights and hand signals. A medical team came out with a stretcher and moved in quickly. I never got a clear look at what they were pulling from under the tree, but I saw the stretcher come back with a covered figure. They loaded it up and lifted off again. Just like that, the whole group of campers stood there, quiet. It didn't feel real. Eventually, someone came around and told us to head back to our campsites. They didn't make a big scene about it, just said that everything was under control and we should clear the area. I walked back to my tent in a bit of a daze. I didn't go back to sleep. I just sat outside in my chair until the sun came up. The woods were quiet again, but not in a peaceful way, more like a stunned silence. The next morning, there was no official announcement, no sign posted or explanation, but word spread quick. The tree had crushed a camper, killed them instantly. Some said it was a man, others said a woman. A few people left early that morning, packed up before the sun was fully up. I stayed until noon, mostly because I didn't want to pack in the dark. But the mood had shifted. Nobody was laughing anymore. No music, no parties, just people packing quietly and leaving. I never went back to Ginny Springs after that. I still camp, still go out into the woods, but something about that night stuck with me. Not just the randomness of it, but how fast something peaceful could turn tragic. The idea that you can do everything right, pick a flat spot, check for dead limbs, set up safely, and still something completely out of your control can happen. I didn't know the person who died, never even saw them, far as I know, but I still think about them every time I pitch a tent. I always check the trees now, not just for widowmakers, but for the ones that lean a little too much, the ones that creak in the wind. I listen to the forest a little differently now, and when I hear a tree fall in the distance, I don't brush it off. I wait, I listen, because now I know what that sound can really mean. I was 17 the summer we went camping way out in the mountains. It was me and 3 of my close friends from school, guys I'd known since we were kids. We were young, stupid, and thought we were invincible. We'd done a few camping trips before, mostly close to home, but this time we wanted to push it a bit further. We wanted to get out where there weren't other campers nearby. Just us, the woods, and silence. We picked a long weekend at the end of summer, packed our gear into a couple of old hiking packs, and planned a hike out into the mountains that would take most of the day. The trail was barely maintained and we had to climb over fallen logs, push through dense brush in places, and cross a couple shallow creeks. The further we got from the main trailhead, the less like a trail it felt. By the time we found a flat, semi-clear patch of ground to pitch our tents, we were scratched up, sweaty, and dead tired. The spot we found wasn't anything special, just a break in the trees with enough flat ground for our tents and a bit of space for a fire pit. But it felt secluded, and that was the point. We were surrounded by thick trees and undergrowth. The forest floor was full of dry leaf litter and twigs that crunched and snapped under every step. You couldn't sneak up on anyone here if you tried, and that actually felt comforting at the time. We set up our tents just before sunset. One of my friends, Mark, got a small fire going while the rest of us unpacked and laid out sleeping bags. We ate quick, mostly just canned stuff and jerky, and sat around the fire as the light faded. The woods out there were dense, and when it got dark fast. No moon that night either. The trees were too thick for any real starlight to get through. When the fire burned down low, we put the last few embers out with some water and climbed into our tents. The air was still. It was that kind of night where sound travels forever. I could hear my friends in their separate tents, shifting, unzipping sleeping bags, rustling around. After about 10 minutes, all of that stopped, and it was just quiet. The kind of quiet where your ears almost start to ring. I didn't fall asleep right away. I never do, especially on those first nights out in the bush. I usually lie there for a while just listening, letting my body calm down after the hike. That's what I was doing when I heard the first noise. It was just a soft crack, like a footstep on a dry twig. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either, maybe 30 feet out. It was followed a few seconds later by another crack. Same kind of sound, not rushed, not random. Felt like something moving with purpose, something walking. My ears perked up and I held my breath. I told myself it was probably just a possum or a wallaby nosing around. You get a lot of that when you're out in the woods. But then I heard another one, this time from a different direction. Then another, closer. The steps weren't quick. They weren't darting around like you'd expect from small critters. These were slow. One, then a pause, then another. Each one sounded like something stepping carefully, methodically, and from more than one direction. I lay there, completely still, my heart starting to pick up. I strained my ears and tried to pinpoint how many there were. It was hard to tell. 3, 4, maybe more? The thing that started to make my skin crawl was how evenly spaced the noises were around the tent. It wasn't like something had stumbled into camp and was rustling around. It was like something was encircling us. I could hear steps directly behind my tent, then some off to the left, then the right. Some a little further, some closer. It started to feel like we were being surrounded. I sat up slowly in my sleeping bag. My flashlight was next to me, and I picked it up without turning it on. I didn't want to draw attention just yet. The air in the tent felt heavier somehow. The kind of pressure that comes with fear, like the oxygen had gotten thicker. The sounds continued, still slow, still careful. I couldn't hear any snorting, growling, or breathing. No branches breaking, just the distinct sound of footsteps in dry leaves and sticks. It was the quietness that made it worse. The night had gone completely still. No insects, no wind in the leaves. Just those measured steps, crunching the litter one at a time. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to see. I reached up and unzipped the corner of my tent just enough to poke my head out. I didn't turn on the flashlight yet. I wanted my eyes to adjust. It was pitch black out there, almost impossible to see anything. I waited a few seconds. The footsteps kept going. I couldn't see movement, but I could hear them getting closer. Then I clicked on the flashlight. The beam cut through the dark like a blade. I swept it slowly in front of me, left to right. The light bounced off trees and brush, and then caught something. Eyes, dozens of them, staring straight back at me. They reflected the beam like marbles in the dark, wide and still. They were spaced high off the ground, about the height of a person.
Some taller.
Some lower, but none of them were down at the level of a dog or a possum. These were chest height at least. My breath caught. The beam shook in my hand. I panned the light slowly, trying to understand what I was looking at. The eyes weren't moving much. They just stared, unblinking. But as I looked closer, I could make out faint outlines behind them. Long legs, slender bodies, ears, deer. It was a whole herd of deer, maybe 20, maybe more, just standing there in a wide circle around our camp, all staring straight at me. I didn't know deer could be so silent. I always thought of them as skittish, noisy things, but these ones had come up on us like ghosts. Not a single snort or stomp. No rustling of bushes, just quiet, deliberate movement. My heart was still hammering in my chest, but the fear started to melt into something else. Confusion, mostly. Why would a group of deer come so close to a campsite? And why would they just stand there like that? I watched them for a long minute. They didn't move. They didn't blink. Just those eyes reflecting the beam. They looked like statues, waiting. Eventually, one of them took a step forward. Then another. Then the rest started to shift, turning as a group and walking off into the dark. Still quiet, still slow. Within 30 seconds, they were gone, swallowed up by the trees. I turned off the light and crawled back into my sleeping bag, heart still racing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, we all staggered out of our tents looking like hell. I didn't even have to say anything. One look at my friends and I could tell none of them had slept much either. I didn't ask if they'd heard anything. I didn't want to admit what I'd seen until they brought it up first. We packed up pretty quick after that. No one said why, just a kind of unspoken agreement. None of us wanted to spend another night there. The hike back was long and quiet. No one joked around like we usually did. We didn't talk about the deer or the noises. It wasn't scary, not in the sense that we were in danger. But something about that night got under my skin. Something about the silence, the way they moved, the way they watched us. I've been camping a lot since then. I've seen deer dozens of times, but I've never seen them act like that again. And I've never camped that far off trail again either. Sometimes it's not what's dangerous that gets to you. It's what's weird, what doesn't make sense, what doesn't follow the rules. That night didn't feel like a normal animal encounter. It felt like we were being watched, measured, judged, and I still don't know why. I wasn't new to camping. I'd done it plenty of times since I was a teenager. Sometimes with friends, sometimes alone when I needed to clear my head. I preferred solo trips more than anything else. There was something about being out in the woods by myself that helped me think better than anything else ever could. No phone service, no cars, no distractions. Just me, my pack, and the woods. That was the plan this time too. I picked a spot about 4 hours out of town, deep into the national forest. It wasn't one of those marked campgrounds with fire pits and gravel tent pads. This was the kind of trip where you hike in a few miles with everything you need, find a good patch of flat ground near some water, and make it home for a few nights. I liked those better. They felt real. I had marked a small clearing I saw on a topographic map, near a bend in a creek. It looked quiet, out of the way. No trails ran near it. That was exactly what I wanted. I left on a Friday morning early. I had the car packed the night before with my gear, tent, sleeping bag, water filter, small camp stove, bear canister, and a dry bag full of food. I parked on a pull-off that looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. The gravel was overgrown and weeds pushed through the cracks. I locked the car, threw on my pack, and started walking. The hike in was rougher than I expected. The path I followed for the first mile or so was clear, but it faded out fast. After that, I was mostly bushwhacking, checking the compass every so often and following landmarks on the map. The brush got thicker the deeper I went. Thorns caught my pants, and I kept needing to brush away spider webs. At one point, I had to backtrack around a steep ravine I hadn't seen on the map. It was slow going, but I didn't mind. Around mid-afternoon, I found the spot. The clearing wasn't big, just a flat space about 30 feet across, surrounded by pine and fir trees. The creek curved right around it, maybe 30 feet away. There was a smooth patch of ground that looked perfect for the tent. A thick moss carpet covered most of the ground. I set my pack down and took a deep breath. It was quiet. No sign of people, no trash, no boot prints. I liked that. The trees hung thick overhead, letting shafts of light through but keeping the air cool and damp. I pitched my tent and got everything organized. Hung my bear bag from a branch a good ways off, filtered some water from the creek, boiled a little for coffee. I sat on a flat rock near the edge of the clearing and just listened. You don't realize how much background noise there is in everyday life until you're deep in the woods and it's gone. No cars, no power lines, no chatter. Just wind through trees, distant birds, and the constant trickle of the creek. The first night passed quietly. I read a bit by headlamp, turned in early, and slept well. The cold air helped with that. I woke up a few times to shift in my bag but heard nothing odd outside. Just the usual rustling from wind and leaves. I wasn't spooked. This was what I came for. The second day, I decided to hike around a bit. I didn't stray too far, maybe half a mile in different directions, just checking out the area. Found some game trails, some neat moss-covered boulders, and a patch of mushrooms that looked out of place. Too many in one spot and all growing in a tight circle. I left them alone. On the way back to camp, I spotted something that felt off, though I didn't know why at the time. A long, straight branch was jammed between two trees in a way that didn't look natural. It was wedged high, maybe 6 feet up, too high to be from a fall. I figured maybe wind did it or a tree cracked nearby. I moved past it. That night was when things started to shift. I cooked some rice and beans on my little stove and sat again near the rock to eat. The woods were quiet. Not just peaceful, silent. The birds I'd heard all day were gone. No frogs from the creek. No insects. Just nothing. It took a while to notice, but once I did, it was hard to ignore. Felt like the woods were holding their breath. I stayed near the fire for a while, poking at the small flames, waiting for the sounds to come back. They didn't. I put the fire out with water, walked slowly around the camp with my headlamp on, and then crawled into the tent. I told myself it was fine, maybe just cooler air keeping the animals quiet. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up. My watch said it was just after 2:30 a.m. I didn't know why I woke. No noise that I could hear. The woods were still silent. I lay there, trying to listen through the nylon of the tent. A faint creak came from behind the tent. Just one. Then silence again. My heart picked up, but I didn't move. A few minutes later, I heard it again. Closer this time. A slow, steady creaking sound, like a branch bending. Not snapping, just movement. I stayed still, hardly breathing. Whatever it wasn't a deer. Deer don't move like that, and bears are louder. I waited maybe 10 minutes, clutching the knife I kept in the side pocket of my pack. Eventually, I heard a soft thud near the edge of the clearing. Then nothing. No walking, no brushing through bushes. Just that one sound. I didn't sleep again that night. By morning, the woods still felt strange. I got up stiff, sore, and tired. I checked around the tent. No tracks, no marks, no signs of animals. Nothing had touched the food bag either. I made coffee, but the feeling didn't go away. I told myself I was just shaken from waking up in the middle of the night. That was all. I was fine. I decided not to hike out yet. I'd planned 3 nights and figured if nothing else happened, I could still enjoy the last full day. I moved slower that day, didn't explore far, stayed near the camp, keeping the fire going longer than usual. I wanted the smoke. It felt like protection. Late in the afternoon, I walked a short loop and came across something I hadn't seen before. Strips of birch bark torn clean from a tree and wide. Even strips, all stacked in a neat pile at the base. That wasn't normal. I looked up. The tree was tall, no branches low enough for me to reach even if I jumped. Something had peeled that bark off. Cleanly, not shredded or scattered like a bear would do. Peeled, stacked. I left it and walked back faster than I normally would. That night, I didn't cook. I ate a cold meal from a pouch and zipped myself into the tent before dark. I didn't want to be outside any longer than I had to be. Again, I woke around the same time. It was cold in the tent, and the kind of stillness outside that doesn't feel right. My ears strained in the quiet. Then I heard it again, creaking. Same as the night before, but slower. I listened harder and realized something terrifying. It was moving, not toward me this time, but around, circling. It would creak, then stop, then another closer to the left, then one farther off, like someone stepping on old, warped boards, except there weren't any boards out here, just moss, dirt, and pine needles. And then it stopped completely. Nothing, not even wind. I lay there gripping my knife again, heart pounding so loud I thought it would give me away. Then something brushed the side of the tent. Not hard, just enough to press the fabric in like a hand tracing it. It moved slow from one end to the other. I couldn't move. I didn't even breathe. Paused at the door zipper, then slid away. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Maybe hours. I waited for light. The moment the sky started to gray, I burst out of the tent, looked around fast. Nothing. No one. No marks on the tent. No prints in the moss. That was it. I was done. I packed everything as fast as I could. Didn't even bother with breakfast. I didn't care about cleaning up camp properly. I was gone. I slung on my pack, grabbed my knife, and started hiking back out. The way out was worse than the way in. My nerves were shot. I heard every branch, every bird, every squirrel like it was a threat. I moved fast, barely stopping to rest. I was just over 2 hours into the hike out when I saw it. Something was hanging from a low branch near the trail I'd marked coming in. It wasn't there before. A strip of that same birch bark, tied in a loop with a twist at the top, like a noose. I didn't stop. I didn't look at it long. I pushed past, faster than before. I got back to the car by mid-afternoon, tossed the pack in, locked the doors, and didn't look back. That was almost a year ago. I haven't been camping since. Not alone. Maybe not ever again. I still think about it sometimes, especially at night. I tell myself there's a logical explanation. Maybe someone else out there, some hermit living off the grid, someone watching. Maybe it was just coincidence or some kind of old structure creaking in the wind. But the way it moved around my tent, the silence, the bark, the loop on the trail. No animal does that. I didn't report it. What would I even say? There was no proof, and I didn't want to give anyone a reason to call it a joke. But I know what I felt out there. That wasn't the woods being quiet. That was the woods watching. And whatever was out there, it didn't want me around. I listened. I'm not going back. It was late summer, just before the new school year started. A group of us, me and 3 of my closest high school friends, had planned a short camping trip out in the woods before everything shifted back to early mornings and homework. We weren't going anywhere fancy, just a remote patch of forest about a 2-hour hike from the main trailhead. Far enough to feel alone, but close enough that we weren't in real danger of getting lost or stranded. We'd been there once before, earlier that spring, so we figured it'd be a good place to return to and wrap up the summer with something memorable. We'd left around noon, parking at the trailhead and heading up with our packs. It was hot that day, and the climb wasn't easy. Steep in a few places, and the late August air was still thick and muggy. We were sweating through our shirts by the time we made it to the clearing. It was a small flat space, surrounded on all sides by a dense wall of pine and oak. The trees were tall and tight, letting in very little light, and the undergrowth was thick in every direction. But the clearing itself was perfect. Mostly flat, quiet, and just big enough for the 4 of us to spread out our tents and build a fire pit. We dropped our packs and got to work, collecting wood, setting up the tents, checking the area for anything sketchy, snakes, poison ivy, whatever. One of us dug a small pit for the fire, and we stacked up dry branches in the middle of it. There was a small stream about 10 minutes away from the clearing, which we used to fill up our bottles after boiling some of the water. By the time everything was set, it was early evening. The sky had gone from blue to hazy orange, and the tree line threw long shadows over the clearing. We ate simple stuff, trail mix, canned soup heated up over the fire, a few hot dogs speared on sticks and roasted. Nothing fancy. Mostly we just talked, joked around, and sat back watching the flames pop and flicker. It had been a long day. Once the sun dipped out completely and the woods turned black around us, the fire became our only real light. No moon that night, not one we could see through the clouds anyway, and the trees made it even darker. It was the kind of dark where you can't even see your hand in front of your face unless there's a fire or flashlight. By midnight, 2 of the guys had already turned in. They weren't far off, just a few feet away in their own tents, zipped up and probably passed out. I stayed by the fire with 1 other friend, both of us sitting in camp chairs and listening to the crackle of the flames and the occasional rustling of wind through the trees. We didn't say much, just sat there. It was peaceful, quiet in a way you never really get when you're near town. No traffic, no dogs barking, no people talking in the distance. Just the woods, just the fire. At around 2 a.m., the fire had burned down to a low flicker. A few red coals glowed in the ash, throwing just enough light to see maybe a few feet beyond the circle of rocks we'd laid around it. My friend had gone to his tent by then, and I sat alone, finishing off a bottle of water and listening to the forest. That's when I heard the first rustle. It was soft, could have been anything. A squirrel maybe, or a bird shifting in the trees. But it was steady, not just one noise, but a pattern. Soft footfalls through dry leaves, something moving. I turned in my chair and looked out into the black trees. Nothing. I grabbed my flashlight, flipped it on, and scanned the tree line. The beam of light cut through the dark like a blade, thin and bright. I moved it slowly left to right, watching the beam reflect off the bark, catching glints off dew or spider webs. Nothing looked out of place. I shut the light off again, chalking it up to my imagination or some harmless animal, and leaned back in my chair. But then I heard it again, closer, still soft, but clear now, something coming through the leaves, not charging, not stomping, just moving forward slowly. It was coming from the trees behind me, I spun around, flicked the flashlight back on, and pointed it directly at the sound. Nothing again. No movement. No eye shine. No branches bending. Then, just as I lowered the beam, something darted out of the woods. It was small, real small. I barely had time to register what it was before it shot past the edge of the fire and straight into the coals. I heard a loud, sharp hiss as it hit. Something wet met something red hot, and the whole fire snapped and crackled like someone had dumped water on it. I jumped out of my chair, flashlight flying out of my hand. A horrible smell filled the air. It was like burning hair and cooked meat mixed with something sour and rotten. I could see the thing writhing on the coals, its tiny body twisting and flailing in the heat. The fire lit up enough for me to finally see it clearly. It was a mole, not a big one, maybe the size of a lemon, but thick and black and alive just seconds before. Now it was cooking alive right there in front of me. Its little paws kicked and curled up tight. The fire hissed again as more of its fur burned away. Couldn't look away. I didn't want to watch, but I couldn't stop. The sounds it made, those short, high-pitched squeals, were sharp enough to cut through the quiet night like glass. It wasn't screaming, not in a way you'd call human, but it was something close enough that it made my chest tighten. By the time the others unzipped their tents and came running out, flashlights in hand, still groggy and confused, the mole had stopped moving. Its body was half buried in the glowing coals, one paw stuck up stiff, like it had been frozen mid-motion. The smell was worse now, thick and oily, and it made us all gag a little. No one said anything. No one had to. We just stood there, flashlights aimed down at the scorched little thing in the middle of our fire pit. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just sat up in my tent, knees to my chest, wide awake and trying to shake the image out of my head. Not just the mole itself, but the way it ran toward us. The way it didn't slow down. The way it almost seemed to dive into the fire on purpose. I told myself that wasn't possible. Animals don't do that. They avoid fire, even the dumb ones. But I had seen it. We all had. The next morning, the air was cool and quiet. Everything felt heavy. None of us talked much. We tore down camp slowly, not in a rush but not dragging it out either. When it came time to clean up the fire pit, we didn't want to just leave the mole there. Felt wrong, like littering or disrespecting something, even though it was just an animal. We found a flat piece of bark and used it to scrape the remains, what little was left, out of the coals. Came up in chunks, some of it stuck to the blackened rock. Bits of bone and flesh and fur all melted together. We carried it a short distance into the woods and dug a hole with our boot heels and a stick. Not deep, maybe a foot down. We placed the burned body in and covered it with dirt, smoothing it out with our hands. One of us placed a flat rock on top. We stood there for a minute after that, just kind of staring at it. No one said anything, but we all felt it. It was just a mole, but the way it died, the timing, the movement, the noise, it shook us up in a way we couldn't really explain. We hiked back out that afternoon. The woods felt different on the way down. Quieter, but not in a peaceful way. It was like everything had gone still. No birds, no wind, no squirrels darting between trees. Just us and the trail. We didn't stop for breaks. We didn't take pictures like we had on the way up. We just kept walking, one foot in front of the other, all the way back to the parking lot. When we got to the car, we dumped our packs in the trunk and sat in silence for a while before starting the engine. I remember turning around one last time to look back at the tree line. You couldn't see the clearing from the lot, but I knew exactly where it was. Somewhere beyond the wall of trees, hidden deep inside the woods, was a small fire pit with a pile of cold ashes and a tiny grave just a few yards away. We never camped there again, and for a while I thought I'd just forget about the whole thing. It was weird, yeah, but it was just one of those strange things that happen sometimes. But even now, years later, I still think about that mole. I think about the way it ran into the fire like it was being chased, or like it was running from something worse, or maybe not running at all, maybe drawn to it somehow. Whatever it was, it didn't feel normal, felt wrong, and I've never looked at a campfire the same way since.